if the government were to change the laws of residency and somehow say that the time spent on television is considered as time spent outside India, then both would have been non-residents for tax purposes for several years in the past and will continue to do so in the future also. Mukesh, it's an absolute privilege having you with us today, and thank you for agreeing to be on this panel. And lastly, we have Dr. CA Advocate Sunil Moti Lala. He's a regular at the tribunal in Mumbai and has, to his credit, a fantastic success rate in winning appeals. A highly articulate orator, he loves to prepare thoroughly for anything that he takes up, whether it's an appeal or a speaking engagement like today's. He too has spoken at the BCAS Society's programs in the past on many occasions. And Sunil, thank you so much for agreeing to be on this panel as well.
Thank you.
And of course, my name also figures in the panel. I'm a past president of the BCAS Society and current chairman of the Taxation Committee. And it's my pleasure to host this program as the organizer. With these few words, without taking any further time from the panelists, I hand over the proceedings to Menaka with a warning to the panelists that unfortunately, though the exam paper was circulated in advance to all of you, our examiner, as expected, has changed the question paper and has put up our own questions. So we are in for a surprise test. And lastly, although the time announced was 5 to 6, with the permission of the panel, we may extend a few minutes more since there are very interesting things to be discussed. And we don't have any hassles of, vacating the hall for a particular, at a particular time, switching off the lights, etc. So over to you, Menaka.
Ameet, thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I have not been available in previous BCA discussions, but trust me, it's not because of any lack of interest in tax. Newsrooms have been kept 24/7 busy over the last several years, and I'll put it down just to that. A warm welcome to all the panelists. I'm keenly looking forward to this conversation because when Ameet reached out, a couple of days ago and said, we'd love to discuss this, for me, it represents a learning opportunity, especially to hear from Mr. Varshney on how the prospects of faceless assessment and appeal, sort of will work out, and then to hear from the tax experts on the panel on what they think could be some of the implementation challenges. So I'm going to start first by asking Mr. Varshney to elaborate for us the operational angle of what the Honorable Prime Minister laid out not very long ago, the vision to move to a faceless process for both tax assessments and tax appeals. Mr. Varshney, can you, in very simple terms, explain, maybe with an illustration, on how this would work differently from how the assessment and appeal process works today?
Thank you so much. Just to illustrate in very simple words, right now what we have is that jurisdictions are defined. So each assessing officer will have a jurisdiction. So the cases which falls into his jurisdiction, he is liable for all actions, for all processing of returns, and in case the case is selected for scrutiny, he need to assess the taxpayer. If demand is to be collected, he has to collect the demand. If appeal is to be filed in tribunal or high court or Supreme Court, he is the person who has to file the appeal. If coordination is to be done with our departmental lawyers, he is the one who is going to do it. So all that work is to be done by him. So he is one person who is doing all different kind of work for the assessees who are within his jurisdiction. So the idea is now, can we move to a more efficient system which is jurisdictionless and which is transparent? Transparent in the sense that your case can go to any person, and it is not that your personal relationship with that person is going to influence the case, or there's any other consideration will not enter into the picture. It is the efficiency. Can we increase the efficiency? So that means increasing efficiency means that can we take this assessment part out of the work of the assessing officer, and that assessing officer will continue to do all other work other than assessment. What I just narrated, demand collection, filing appeal, liaising with department lawyer, all other work that he can continue with respect to the people in his jurisdiction, but the assessment work is taken out and it goes to the faceless team. Now in faceless team, there is a national center and then there are regional centers. So first it will go to national center, and the national center can assign your case to any regional center, and that happens automatically. And then from that regional center, there are checks and balances that how assessment is to be done. If any communication is to be done, communication will be all through National E-Assessment Center. So not by the person who is assessing your case, all communication will be from centralized place. If any verification is to be done, then there's a separate verification unit. If any technical advice is to be obtained, then there is separate technical unit. Then there is also review unit. So the idea of review unit is that whatever draft assessment order is prepared by the assessing officer, can somebody else also have a look at that to ensure that it is proper. Now, once again, all this is happening in a faceless manner so that the real knowledge of officers are pooled in to make a error-free assessment and a quality assessment. Now, that is what is a very important aspect of this particular scheme. See, if you know, our Prime Minister Modi spoke about 0.25% of scrutiny being done. So when we say only 0.25% of taxpayers are subject to scrutiny, what is the idea behind it? It is not a mechanical process. I mean, scrutiny is not an end in itself. It is a means to achieve an end. And what is the end? End is to increase voluntary compliance. That means the work that we do in these 0.25% cases must be illustrative for other 99.75% of cases. Now, those 99.75% of cases will have honest taxpayers. Now, these honest taxpayers expect that if somebody else is not honest and his case is picked up for scrutiny, then he must be made to pay tax and penalty. And if there is a case of tax evasion, he must also be prosecuted. So that is what the expectation of the honest taxpayer is. And that is what the expectation of the tax department also is. Because only if you do that, then 99.75% cases also have potential tax evaders who are fence sitters. You know, you have to send a message to them that don't cross the fence, be honest taxpayer, pay your tax properly, because if your case is selected for scrutiny, of course, that selection criteria also to be refined based on artificial intelligence. We are having a lot of data now we are collecting from various sources. Now that data is to be mined properly, and using artificial intelligence, we need to come out with a system where we select most of the cases that we select, we are able to detect some tax evasion. Now, I'm not saying that if 0.25% cases are selected and when we do faceless assessment, we find nothing, then we should pass nil assessment order. There's nothing wrong in it. But the idea is that using our artificial intelligence, we are able to come up with a strategy where mostly those cases are selected where there is an evasion, so that we can set an example to the outside world. So that is the idea, that we bring more transparency, more efficiency into the process. Because currently, for whatever reason, there is very less impact of scrutiny assessment, and a lot of resources are put in scrutiny assessment. So if we can do the same work more efficiently with less resources, this resource which is free, we can use it for other work. And when I say other work, means we have other work of taxpayer service. So taxpayer service means we can educate our taxpayer. There are areas like advanced pricing agreement. We can put more resources there to provide tax certainty to taxpayers. Then tax evasion is another area we have to concentrate, that we need to stop tax evasion. So we can strengthen that area. So that means if we can put less number of officials into assessment and produce better result, why not? I mean, that is what the technology is all about. It doesn't mean that we are going to reduce manpower, but we can use this manpower for better work. We can use manpower for collecting outstanding demand. I mean, we all have been hearing that how much demand is outstanding. So many times the taxpayer is not traceable. So can we have, now with the use of technology, can we trace the taxpayer? Now the same assessing officer is doing assessment, he's doing demand collection, he's doing everything. Probably he's not able to spend his energy and time onto that aspect. So now can we have special people who are going to focus on that and trace the taxpayer and get the demand collected from him, which is confirmed demand. So this is the complete reorientation of the department and a path creating step, I must say. So I think I'm just trying to explain you in a very simple language. I hope I've been clear. Thank you.
No, well, absolutely, sir. I'm the only non-chartered accountant on this panel, and I've understood all of it. So thanks very much. That was easy to understand. I have a quick couple of follow-up questions to you before I take this to the rest of the panelists, just to understand better. So, like the Prime Minister said, this scrutiny case of a taxpayer in Mumbai can be allocated to an officer in Guwahati, and an appeal against this decision will go to an officer in a third state. Now, will either of those officers know the identity of the taxpayer? I'm just curious to know, because if they do know the identity of the taxpayer, is there any potential for them to subvert this faceless, non-adversarial system that you all are trying to set up and still try and create some degree of personal contact?
Yeah, so once again, in the faceless assessment team also, it is not one team who is doing everything. That one team is also not one individual. There are other officers who are in the team. So it's a teamwork. And then there is another team who is going to review the work. Verification, some third team is doing. Technical advice, some other team is doing. So therefore, when a lot of people have been engaged, I think the transparency part that you were referring to, that is adequately taken care of. And then most importantly, I think the message has gone down very well with the masses. Media has been very kind enough for covering all this over the last 3-4 days. So now taxpayer knows that he is not expected to get any call from anyone. Now, if suppose, we are sure that this is not going to happen, but if anything happens, then probably the taxpayer must complain, and that is certainly not tolerable. Anybody making a phone call to the taxpayer or to the tax consultant is just not on from the faceless assessment team. I can understand from the assessing officer, because he may have to collect demand. So he may be contacting you that this is a demand outstanding. Please tell me how you are going to pay it. That's a different matter. But from faceless assessment team, there is absolutely no reason for making phone call. And if that message is known to all taxpayers, and taxpayers are, and they know that if they complain, their case is not going to be affected, because it will not remain with that officer. Unlike the present case, that your case will always be with your jurisdictional officer. So if you are afraid of saying anything about your officer, so that is not the case now, because it is faceless, because it is jurisdictionless. So therefore, there will be no apprehension in the mind of the person who has received phone call. First of all, we believe he will not receive phone call, but if he receives, there are sufficient avenues available to make a complaint.
Okay, thank you for that candid answer. One other quick question, sir. The Prime Minister spoke about this as well, and we know from data that the number of tax returns scrutinized every year have fallen. They're down by a fourth. I think the numbers are 0.94% in FY13, now down to about 0.25% in FY19. How do these scrutinies or assessments get triggered? What is the data that you see that could likely trigger this scrutiny or assessment? I'm asking you a very layperson question. And will that change in any fashion now as you use, more data, information, AI, etc.?
So we have been using computerized assistance selection of cases for scrutiny. That has been happening for many years, and parameters have been redefined based on our past experience. So what happens is, and nobody knows, even department officer, I will not know what are those parameters and what are those parameters being changed every year unless I'm part of that committee. Only the committee members know, and the people in the system who are actually implementing those parameters would know. Otherwise, nobody knows what are those parameters, and those parameters keep changing every year. Now, with the artificial intelligence, you have a lot of data. So here is a very important professional work that is required to be done, that you select, correct the cases which are required to be scrutinized should be selected, and not the cases which are not required to be scrutinized. Easier said than done, but that is a job of the person who are doing data mining, job of the people who are using artificial intelligence, and the success of this scheme will also depend on the type of cases that are selected.
All right, fair enough. Thanks, Mr. Varshney, for that. I'm going to come back to you in a bit, but I'm right now going to expand this to the rest of the panelists. Mr. Butani, there are obviously 3 levels implementation challenges in any such policy, however good the intent is. One will be just the operational challenges. For instance, do you have the technology in place for something like this? Can you connect seamlessly to be able to achieve these faceless assessments and appeal closures, etc.? The second is the cultural challenge, right? We've been doing things in one way in this country's tax administration for a very, very long time. And whilst this is a landmark change, how long it will take for both sides to adapt to this. And the third is the legal change, which is that will this be able to reduce litigation? Will this be able to reduce the number of cases that we have? Let me come to you for the first one. Operational issues. What do you anticipate could be some of the implementation challenges?
Well, I think everything is in eating it, so we will have to figure out what are the operational issues that are coming up. Let me just focus on the cultural issues, conventional issues. So if you open the newspaper in the morning, the Association of IRS Officers have written a letter to the CBDT chairman saying that they were not consulted upon. Now, thanks to our Indian democracy, everybody has a voice. So they are expressing a voice. It is basically they're expressing a voice and saying, Mr. Prime Minister, you should have consulted with us. Now, in my view, that's a big challenge because that challenge could balloon into situations where the field officers are not actually doing what they are supposed to or expected to do as per the scheme. Now, you see, we have to look at the framework of the law today. The root cause of the problem is the empowerment and the discretion that is there under the law with the officer. Now, to a larger extent, the new scheme substantially reduces that discretion, substantially reduces that empowerment. So Mr. Varshney spoke about the fact that you are not just going to not know who your assessing officer is, but whoever this assessing officer who has been assigned the job is not the final authority. He spoke of teamwork, and in the context he talked about the assessment unit, the technical unit, the review unit. I think it's a major shift in the way in which assessments are done. And I think the adaptability factor, in my view, is very critical. I think it will require sustained efforts to train the officials to be able to adapt to the new system. So I think, and I have no doubt in my mind that there would be teething problems, but the larger intent of the policy is something which cannot be questioned. Let's come to your point on litigation. Again, we need to wait and see if this indeed reduces the litigation or increases the litigation. But one thing which is very clear to me is that by choosing a smaller sample, which statistically, as you correctly pointed out, has gone down even in the last 3 years, you're looking at one first filter being applied by the artificial intelligence to choose only those cases where you could have cases of tax evasion or not proper income being disclosed. And then you are doing a detailed scrutiny. You're actually allocating resources to deal with only 0.25% of the cases. Well, if you devote more resources to fewer number of taxpayers, you're bound to come with a better outcome. But I think the risk over there is to what extent the officers are empowered to take positions aligned with the law. So what is the most common problem that a taxpayer has? A taxpayer has one appeal in an appellate forum, but the officer says, no, well, the department has been an appeal to the High Court and the Supreme Court. I take the point that you're making, but I'm not going to give you that relief. So those are some of the changes that are there. I would say that in order to make this phenomenally successful, besides the training, there ought to be very well documented SOPs for the officers in what situations they are supposed to do it. Now, the technical committee there can play a very instrumental role. It is a technical committee that can guide the officers how assessments have to be done in those situations. So I think to a larger part, You have to wait and see how this system evolves. Now, let me give you one example, because the e-assessment procedure started before the faceless assessment procedure. Faceless assessment procedure got triggered off only in September 2019. So we are seeing the first set of 60,000 odd cases that were picked up by the department. But the e-assessment has been in vogue earlier. I was arguing an appeal in the morning today on the first e-assessment case, where what the officer seems to have done is he's taken all the information, but he has sought all of the information at the last moment. He's obviously not verified that information, so he has given the benefit of doubt. I had a very easy process to be able to explain that none of these information had been looked at, and the tribunal had a very easy job to say, okay, let's send the matter back, because this seems to be a classic case where the officer has not looked at it. Now, in my view, the faceless assessment travels beyond the e-assessment procedure. But I think the key will lie on how you train the officers and what kind of SOPs you issue to them by way of guidance. And even the technical committee can play a very important role to be able to make sure these assessments are done with the intent with which they're supposed to be.
Okay, fair enough. Let me come to Dr. Lala, with a similar kind of question, Dr. Lala, but narrowing it even further, written submissions, the standardization that will be required for a faceless process to work, is going to be of a very, very high level. Mr. Butani's already articulated some aspects of that. What do you think it will take for a system of this nature to work as smoothly as anticipated, for it to actually achieve any of the goals that the Prime Minister set out or the department has set out?
So, when you speak of written submissions, this is something which has been happening right from inception. So though there is a personal hearing given by the commissioner invariably asks for a written submission, even in a personal hearing, or the SSE himself wants to give it just to prove it in the tribunal that he has argued all those points before the commissioner. So on that front, I don't see much of a challenge for the SSE, except that he would have to get more familiar with the technology. Normally when you are face to face before the commissioner, you can take him through the documents and guide him as to where is what. So I would think an executive summary of the detailed submission, I think, would be very helpful, which is a practice already being carried on at the DRP level. So, so not much change on that front. It's just that one would have to familiarize yourself in terms of technology. The signatures would have to be digital. In that sense, I don't see much of a challenge for the SSC in this new system in terms of written submissions are concerned.
If I was to use written submissions as just an illustration of the many things that will need to get standardized, or an SOP, as Mr. Butani was talking about, what do you think will be of most urgent action?
So, both these, there are two sections I'm talking about. One is 143, which is more to do with the assessment, and the other is the appellate proceedings, which is under section 250. Both these sections, 143 has a section called 143.3a and 3b, in pursuance of which these notifications have been issued in terms of assessment. Having said that, and these sections talk of really a faceless assessment. Despite that, the notifications do talk of a personal hearing, if required from the department, or if a request is made by the assessee. But now the personal hearing has become, it's not a norm, but it can still happen. What is missing today is there are similar provisions in section 250, which is a hearing before the commissioner appeals. And we don't have notification for that as yet. So though there is a scope to have a personal hearing during an assessment, as of now, there seems to be no notification to suggest that there could be a scope for a personal hearing before a commissioner. And since these proceedings would start sometime after 25th September, I think all are eagerly looking at that. So this is one aspect. I think in terms of SOP, which is internal, since this is largely a faceless assessment, I think the commissioner appeals should be more liberal in terms of an assessee, allowing an assessee to raise an additional ground, to file additional evidence, and to take up additional pleas. I think since this is a first year, I think it would make sense if an internal note is circulated that where they can be more liberal on this, keeping in mind that this is the first year, and an SOP to that effect within the department would serve a good purpose.
Okay. And do you believe that, if some of these things are put in place fairly quickly, this could in fact also reduce litigation? Can you give us a view on whether you think this might achieve that as well?
Yeah. So to my mind, I think this is a step in the right direction to reduce litigation. Now, the reason, few days back in the business standards, some data was put up, which said that 0.56% of the litigation, so which is less than 1% of the cases which are being litigated, constitute more than 50% of the total outstanding demand. Right. So less than 1% of the litigation, it really takes care of more than half of the total demand. Now, what does this say? This data proves one thing, that a lot of the litigation is on small matters. That is first point. The second data which comes out in the print media is that the revenue officers' orders are being upheld to the extent of 15 to 30%, which means 70 to 80% of the orders are not being upheld. Now, why is this happening? The reason is twofold. One is every officer has been given a particular budget, that this is the kind of collection they expect from them. And we are having a frank discussion, and no offense to anybody, not every officer is of the caliber and integrity of Kamlesh sir on the thing. But what happens is an officer many a times, in order to favor an assessee, mind you, and this is the irony here, he will raise a frivolous demand, and that is actually, he says he's doing a favor to the assessee. And he clearly says that don't worry, your matter will be knocked off in appeal. And that's a favor. So he's saying, look, I'll raise a demand of 10 crores on you. And that he's doing it as a favor. But he says, don't worry, it'll be knocked off. Now, with a faceless assessment, what will happen? The scope of this will clearly reduce. So you won't have an officer trying to oblige you by giving you a matter, by giving an order, which will be knocked off in appeal. So therefore, so in that sense, the frivolous litigation will definitely reduce. Now, the meaningful litigation, and I think this is the side effect of it, may increase a bit. Because let's say if you're taking up 6 grounds in a particular appeal, you may now take up 10 grounds. It may happen. But if one weighs the pros and cons, then to my mind, the pros would outweigh the cons. So the litigation will increase more towards qualitative litigation, and the frivolous litigation will come down.
Okay, fair enough. Amit, I'm going to come to you. I think, Dr. Lala raised this issue of tax targets. And so, same question, the challenges of implementing this, whether it's operational, cultural, or from a legal point of view, and from the fact that in this country, almost every good intent expressed at the top falls victim to the fact that at the end of the day, every year we fall short of our tax collections. The targets are ambitious, and tax officers then raise all kinds of queries and resulting in unending litigation to be able to make up those tax targets that their seniors have set them. Do you believe that that could potentially undo some of the good intent behind an effort of this nature?
No, I don't think so. Because as Mr. Varshney mentioned, that basically the whole the focus is shifting from the jurisdictional officer to somebody unknown, a faceless person. So the demand is being raised by Mr. A. It is only being recovered by Mr. B. Okay, please pardon the gender this thing, Mr. or Miss, whatever it is. The point is that ultimately to make this whole process of faceless assessment, faceless appeals succeed and make it work, basically the government will have to also rethink the whole concept of assigning the targets may be there, but the way that it will be administered will need to change. And therefore, if a Bombay-based jurisdictional officer has no control on the kind of demands that are being raised in his jurisdiction, he has only to recover those demands, then I don't think it would be fair on the part of the government to give him targets without him having any control over the raising of those demands. So I think in all probability, and Mr. Varshney would be a better person to comment on this, in all probability, the whole system will need to be changed as far as the assigning or collection of particular amounts from each sector is concerned. That's what I feel. So this is work in progress. And earlier you raised a question on Mukesh about the operational issues that could be faced.
Operational, cultural, and legal. All of them, as you would like to address.
Correct. So he spoke about the cultural issues. I would like to develop a bit upon the operational issues, because I have been personally involved with these e-assessments that have happened. And therefore, I would like to take this opportunity to convey certain things to Mr. Varshney with the confidence that he will be listening carefully, and he would also, understand what I'm trying to say. In the e-assessment that we have already experienced, there were a few problems. First problem was about the number of attachments or number of submissions that can be made by a taxpayer. There was a curb on the number of attachments. There was a curb on the size of the attachments. That was one problem. Second problem was that many times the officer insisted on the physical copies, even though this is supposed to be an e-assessment. Obviously, in the case of faceless, this demands won't come. But this was a second problem that we faced. The third problem was that often some of the submissions, particularly the later ones, as the due date for passing the order started coming nearby, the officers sometimes ignored the latest submissions, or whether intentionally or unintentionally, one doesn't know. But many times the submissions were not taken into consideration. Now, this is a huge problem. So I would suggest to Mr. Varshney and to whoever from the DIT system, if at all anybody is listening or watching this discussion, that the orders, when they are passed, should automatically, without any intervention of the officer, contain a list of the dates on which the various submissions have been made by the SSE. That will automatically bring onto the face of the order all the dates. I'm just saying the number or the dates or something, some kind of indication should be there that the SSE has submitted a written reply on the electronic system on A, B, C, D, E, F, G dates. That will bring in accountability onto the system also, because not only are officers supposed to be accountable, but the system also has to be robust. And 90% of the problems which have been faced by taxpayers and tax professionals in the country for the past 10 years in the context of e-filing have all been technological. They have not been human. So the technology has to live up to the expectations of the government, of the Prime Minister, of the taxpayers, and of the tax professionals. Unless that happens, unless the technology is foolproof, this is going to be a problem. Another suggestion to Mr. Varshney is, sir, at present, the e-assessment is to be conducted through the e-filing portal. Now, e-filing portal, we all know what kind of troubles are faced when the due dates for filing the returns, tax audits, etc. come. 31st July, 30th September, 30th November, the system crashes. If for any reason, the assessments are also being conducted at those periods in July, September, November, which are peak periods, then I don't know what will happen to the system. The return filing will stop, and the submissions for the assessments will stop. The submissions for the appeals will stop. So one sincere request is that you break up the two systems. At least the server should be separate as far as assessment and appeals is concerned, and e-filing of returns and other forms is concerned. That will ease the pressure on the system. So this is I could not resist taking this opportunity to pass on certain unsolicited suggestions to Mr. Varshney.
Thanks very much. Ameet, now we know why you organized this discussion. The rest of us are incidental to it. But no, let me take many of these concerns to Mr. Varshney. I'm sure that the teams there have already put their mind to several of these issues that we're discussing at this point in time. Let's see what his responses are. Mr. Varshney, first, let me start by asking you about the cultural issue that Mr. Butani raised and the letter that has been written by a couple of tax officers associations to the Prime Minister saying they have not been adequately consulted in this shift to faceless assessment and faceless appeals, and that they are genuinely concerned whether this will impact their targets, this will impact tax collection, and what kind of pressure it will put on officers themselves to be able to live up to their jobs.
Thank you. First of all, very useful suggestions by the three co-panelists, and surely, I mean, if the scheme is to be successful, everybody has to go along, and these suggestions have to be kept in mind. Coming to the specific question that you raised about the letter which is written by the association. So let me just first clarify that we have three associations. One is IRS Association. Second is Income Tax Gazetted Officers Association, which is the officers who are promoted, not directly recruited. And third is Income Tax Employee Federation. So they are the officials who are working in the Income Tax Department. All three associations have welcomed the move. And the letter that Mr. Butani is talking about, yes, it did mention about the discussion, but it did not say anything about pressure on tax collection or anything of that sort. In fact, it said that this is a very good step and we are going to support whatever Prime Minister has envisaged and whatever is the vision of our Prime Minister, and they are fully supported. Yes, they did raise there some concern about transfer posting, and that's very natural. Associations are supposed to represent their concern about transfer posting. So all that was visible on that letter of support given by them to the Prime Minister was the concern about transfer posting and promotion. So that is fine. I mean, CBDT will definitely take those concerns into consideration. About your concern about target, let me clarify that in faceless assessment, if at all there is any grievance that the officer is bound by the target and therefore he is making additions which should not have been made, those will be taken care of in faceless assessment, because the officer who is doing faceless assessment does not have a tax collection target. He may have target about number of assessment, that's all right, but he does not have a tax collection target. So that concern, if at all it is a concern, it would automatically get resolved now.
Okay, all right. That's the first concern that you're speaking with. So you're saying that the officer who's in charge of the assessment of the appeal, the tax target does not apply to him. It will apply to the jurisdictional officer that you were referring to when it comes to being able to raise demands. Is that how it works?
So how it will be implemented, tax collection target, but surely it will not be on the officer who is making the assessment in
so how will it, so could you clarify how it will be implemented? So because somehow many of our efforts sort of come unstuck on the fact that every year we scramble to make the overall budget target, and then that leads to all kinds of distortions in the system.
No, there won't be any distortion. See, these are all professional things. These things are there even in outside other countries also. So overall target will be there for CBDT. Of course, government expect, budget will, have a figure that how much they expect to collect from direct taxes. And the purpose of all this exercise is that because there is going to be more efficiency, that there will be higher collection of taxes. But how that is going to happen, that will be rolled out in future. But one thing is sure, there cannot be a collection target on the person doing faceless assessment.
So are you saying there will not be, or there cannot be?
Yeah, there will not be, whatever. I mean, let's not go on this terminology, but that problem will not be there. That officer is making addition because there is a pressure of target on him. That will not be there.
Okay. Two operational issues that Mr. Butani and Ameet pointed out. One is, the technology, the ability of the system to be able to deal with traffic. Ameet has articulated it in great detail. Would you like to respond on the preparedness?
Yeah, see, Preparedness is not that it is something new. I mean, my co-panelist also spoke about that e-assessment started early, and Mr. Sunil also spoke about that he is even arguing a case on tribunal. Yes, there are some concerns which were expressed by them, which would be taken care of. So experience is there. And then faceless assessment started in September 2019. So it is not something that totally officers are not experienced. So they have had experience in these processes. It's just that these processes have been refined further. Now, they would be assessing a case of some other city instead of assessing their own assessee. Now that is a major difference. So that major difference is not going to impact on his performance. I mean, how he is going to do it. Yes, the new, something new which has come up on the table is team assessment, teamwork. So that is something which is new, that you will have to work as a team. If you want to do verification, there is a team for that. If you want technical input, there is a team for that. So all these things will happen. See, try to understand, whenever there are changes in any organization, these issues will come up because the employees of that organization to some extent will not be experienced for the new process. Now these ultimately there are well laid down principle of management of changes, that how these changes have to be managed, and department has done it before. It is not that something it is happening for the first time. If you remember, when e-filing was introduced, there were a lot of concern being raised that how it is going to happen, because people were used to filing paper return, that how can there be a tax claim without I am submitting my form 16 or form 16A. These were very concern which were raised by the people, that how you are going to allow tax credit without my physical verification form, and how it will impact everything, the whole process. But the new process was put in place, and all that processing was shifted to Bangalore, and you see the result. Refunds were so expedited and people were so happy that the complete system of refund issuance was changed, and a lot of grievances in refunds were resolved. So we have had this experience before. Of course, this reform is bigger than that reform. There's no doubt. But we have had experience of change management in the past, and so therefore one can always fall back upon that experience to bring bigger reform.
All right. And we understand that there will be teething trouble to begin with, both operationally from a people point of view. But, I suppose one has to live through it. The other issue Mr. Butani brought up was that of SOPs. Can you talk us through how some of this will get standardized so that this will work seamlessly?
Yeah, obviously those SOPs will be issued. See, it is only 13th August this announcement was made by Honorable Prime Minister, and we have issued jurisdiction order. We have issued gazette notification for the scheme. There was earlier scheme, we amended that scheme. So the things are happening, So they just wait for some time. Everything will be put in place. SOP will be there. Training of officers will be there. Everything will be in place. I mean, CBDT is well aware of the process it has to follow and the steps it is required to take to make this scheme successful. All the people who are in charge of this work are putting a lot of efforts, and all these things will happen out in a short period of time. Everything will be put in place.
Okay, fair enough. We have tons of questions that have already started coming in from the more than 340 participants that we have. A quick word to those of you who are tuned in, and if you are posting a question as registered in this webinar, please do not send very long questions, because it's very difficult while a panel discussion is going on to comprehend the question, to pressy it, and then pose it to the guest as required. So brief questions would help. And so since we have raised these issues already right now, I'm picking up a couple of questions that are already pertinent to these issues and putting them both to you, Mr. Varshney, as well as to the panelists. Mr. Varshney, a question has come in: what is the relevance of the jurisdictional officer in the present scheme? I think you sort of explained that. Much of his work will now have to do with being able to collect on the demands, etc., right?
Right, exactly. That I have explained. That, faceless work is only for the assessment. There are a lot of work which are required to be done post-assessment. That post-assessment work will be done by the same jurisdictional officers.
Okay. Another gentleman has raised this issue of documents and evidence being presented in regional languages, and whether that will be in any ways a big hurdle, because the documents will go to some officer in another state who might not be familiar with this. Would you like to quickly respond to this issue?
No, so it is not. See, our is a service, which is not cadre, is cadre-based service. That I am from a UP cadre, so I will be posted only in UP, or I am from Karnataka cadre, so I will be posted only in Karnataka. So ours is not that kind of service. North Indian gets posted in South India, South Indian get posted in North India, East into West, West into East. I mean, it's all over. So these issues are not new. When officers get posted in Chennai, suppose I get posted in Chennai, I do not know Tamil, and I can face this same problem. But we are already handling with this. So it is not something new. So there are facilities available, and it is not a concern at all.
Okay. Another quick question that's come in, whether this faceless assessment and appeal would be applicable even for pending appeals?
So for appeal, the 25th September is the date of launch, and the rules are being drafted. They will come out. It is not proper for me to speak on that before they are made public by the government.
Okay. There's another interesting question that's come in, saying the contribution to total tax through the scrutiny system has been very meager so far. Do you expect that this will increase through the new faceless assessments?
So let me just give an example. There were two commissioners of police talking about. So one commissioner of police said that I did not collect any fine in Challan for overtaking red light. The other commissioner of police said I collected 1 crore rupees last month. Who is more efficient? Okay, so there are a lot of angles to it. So let's not judge only by the fact that how much collection scrutiny is bringing. I said in the beginning of my address that the purpose of scrutiny is to send a message to taxpayers, honest taxpayer, that you are doing right thing. Dishonest taxpayer, that you are not doing the right thing. If that message is coming out of our scrutiny assessment, that is what matters, not the collection.
Okay. I'm sure we will have more questions about the faceless process, both from our panelists as well as from the other guests who have tuned in. But in the interest of time, I will get to the other issue that the Prime Minister raised in his speech that we all want to talk about, and that is the adoption of a tax charter, a statutory adoption of a tax charter. And I know that Mr. Butani is amongst those that has written passionately about this, I know, on Bloomberg Quint as well. So I'm literally going to hand it over to him to give us an assessment of what he thinks of this tax charter that the government has put in place. I'm not sure there were extensive consultations on this. So I was, in fact, for one, quite surprised that the charter is already in place and has been announced. Mr. Butani, do you think it covers all the points that it needed to?
Well, we need to see the fine print to see if it covers everything which is covered as global best practices. Charters of nations vary from nation to nation. Sometimes it's an outcome of what are the constitutional requirements of the nation. Sometimes it is an outcome of the legislation, which is the tax legislation. Now let's look at the history of India. The Citizens Charter of 2014, which is often talked about, is actually not a charter which came in for the first time. If I go back into the history of charters, the non-statutory charters, it came in from 1998, immediately after the voluntary disclosure scheme came in. Now, these charters came in various formats, okay, but none of them had any statutory recognition. It came more by way of an administrative circular. Let me give you an example. In 2006, a concept of tax ombudsman was born, and a tax ombudsman was someone who was the senior commissioner and actually looked into the complaints of the taxpayers, which has got to do with refunds, timely, so on and so forth. Now, that is just one of the forms of a tax charter, but that did not because it did not have any statutory recognition. So what does the taxpayer do if his complaints is not being dealt effectively by the tax ombudsman? Now, the argument on tax charter has evolved considerably, not just in India because of the excesses of the tax administration or taxpayers facing harassment at the hands of the officials, or for that matter, high-pitched assessments, but globally, this move has been on. Now, various countries have adopted different forms of charter. So the landmark development that has occurred is that in 2020 budget, it was recognized that tax charter would be an integral part of our statute and not merely be an administrative requirement. The second step was the announcement that occurred last week. And that announcement put out a host of issues that would be dealt with in the tax charter and a host of obligations that will have to be fulfilled by the taxpayers. Now, if you look at those 12, 13 points on the tax charter requirements, they essentially replicate what exists by way of tax charter in many, many jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. And as well, the proof of pudding is in eating it. How do you really implement the tax charter? Now, let's come to what would I like to see. What I would like to see is that how is the government going to implement the tax charter? Is it merely a statement of intent? I hope not. I don't think it would be, because if it was a statement of intent, it would not have been statutorily passed by Parliament. But what is the redressal mechanism? Is there a reporting requirement? Let me give an example. And Mr. Varshney has been an author of this. Government implemented the implementation of the advanced pricing agreement is dubbed as one of the very popular ones, just given the sheer number of APAs. Of course, there is criticism on how much time it takes for India to conclude the APA authorities. But there is a mechanism where annually, every year, CBDT releases a report. So many APAs we received, so many we resolved, so on and so forth. So there is a tracking mechanism. So I would like to see that if we need to implement the taxpayer charter, is there a reporting mechanism? Is there an accountability mechanism? Ideally, I would have liked that the tax charter would be implemented at the board level, preferably by someone who's senior. You can have a former, and there are many, many celebrated former chairmen of the CBDT, because they would act independently. Suppose there is an officer who's been errant. There are complaints of harassment. There are consistent high-pitched assessments that the officer has passed, and all the appellate authorities have been striking off those. So is there any accountability of that officer? Is the government taking actions against the officer? So those are some of the mechanics of the charter we would like to see to make this as an effective instrument in India.
Okay. I want to ask you, Mr. Butani and Dr. Lala, both this question. I'm looking at the points that the government released as the salient features of the charter. Let me put it that way. I have two simple questions. Will a taxpayer have the right to enforce these in any way legally if they become part of the statute? For instance, one of the salient features is treat the taxpayer as honest.
Of course.
Right? Second is to collect the correct amount of tax.
Yeah.
How does one enforce this as a taxpayer?
Well, today, Menaka, as we are speaking, taxpayers enforce it constitutionally. Let me give you two recent examples. If you look at the manner in which the investigation authorities of Service Tax Department in 2018 arrested a CFO of a large make my trip business, we actually filed a writ petition and the court simply said that the entire arrest was illegal. I think that was a classic situation where a taxpayer right was getting violated. He did not have a right to be listened. He did not have a right to defend his case. There was no assessment. There was no show cause notice. The investigation authority relied on an amendment in the 2003 budget which conferred the arrest powers. And what the High Court said towards the end, and Supreme Court affirmed it, is that there are two fundamental problems in this case. Number one, the investigative authorities have gone much beyond the mandate of the law to arrest a person without a show cause notice. The second aspect, which is a more important aspect that the High Court has said, is that the guidelines laid down by the Supreme Court in the celebrated D. Basu case, a person has to be treated before an arrest was not complied with. So this was a classic case where nobody could do anything in the government. We went up to the highest officials in the government. Nobody could do anything, but the court has to redress it. Now, in a tax charter situation, these situations should not happen. There should be a senior officer or an administrator or a body that should intervene in these situations. I'll give you another example. In 2018, the Department of Revenue released an action plan, and it said commissioner appeals will be rewarded for enhancing assessment, will be rewarded for levy of penalty. So writ petitions were filed by associations, one in Bombay High Court and one in Delhi High Court. The Department of Revenue withdrew it because it went against a fundamental right. A commissioner appeals who's supposed to be giving a relief to the taxpayer, how can he be now incentivized for raising the demand? So these instances, and there are many, many instances where high courts have passed strictures against the administration for not treating the taxpayer. Now you need to look at the spirit of those 15 action points on what constitutes the Charter of Rights for the taxpayer. And each of them now has to be properly articulated so that the taxpayers, rather than knocking the courts of the door of the courts or having a long drawn litigation, actually goes to an authority and says, my rights are getting violated.
So this is where I get confused about this tax charter stuff. I know that other countries have implemented it, but Dr. Lala, we have a peculiarly adversarial tax system maybe in India, or maybe it is worse in other countries, I don't know, but we can complain only about our country. If there is already enough provision for legal recourse on many of these issues, then how is a tax charter going to help a tax-paying citizen like me? What is it that it will allow me to enforce my rights in a better way, or will it allow me to go to a different, through a different process, to be able to enforce those rights, not have to get into long-drawn court litigation, but maybe go back to the some sort of authority formed under this? Or will that authority be well equipped? How are you expecting all of this to work out? Or is it right now a feel-good paper that tells you, hey, the government will do all of these nice things, and then we'll see?
Yeah. So as of now, I agree with Mukesh. Whatever has happened, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So as of now, wherever a grievance has come against the revenue officer, it is the High Court which is really intervened.
Right.
And those are either through by way of a writ petition at times, and even in appellate proceedings, the High Court, I have witnessed this myself in quite a few cases in Bombay High Court, that the judge has actually called the assessing officer in court and reprimanded him and also avoided costs. So what has been happening through by way of writ jurisdiction, when there is no alternate remedy, that's been happening. But there have been charters in the past, but this is for the first time a charter has got statutory recognition in section 119 capital A. But really to make this more effective, and my sense is there should be a redressal mechanism within the department itself, and one should really go, because High Court can be an expensive process. It may be a good thing to file, address your grievances in the department, and if one does not get relief there, then may file a writ to the High Court. And now, since this has got statutory recognition, I think the logical implementation should be the key. So really that should be the difference between what was and what should be now, is the statutory recognition, which is already there. And two, is a mechanism should be put in place right now within the department with the higher ups. And then one could probably go to the High Court.
But this is the same department that's supposed to be honoring the charter.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't do so, we are expecting the higher ups in the department to be able to bring discipline to, let's say, junior officers. So
when I say either higher ups or CBDT. So in the past, when there were informal complaints being raised to the principal CIT, but nothing. It was just lying dormant. With this, I'll be happy if they can. It should not be just a statement of intent, a feel-good factor. I think if the department themselves can be, because this is what it says, hold its authorities accountable. If you see charter, the point number 9, it says hold authorities accountable. Now, who will hold its authorities accountable? This obviously the charter means that the department will hold its authorities accountable. If we really have to go to the court again, then what is the object of this charter? Which was happening in the past also. But really, I think the department, as you rightly said, it's just not empty words. They should really move some steps ahead in this, as to we have put a mechanism in place. The only issue here which will arise, because it is faceless, the grievance which was in the past in terms of corruption may not be as much now, because they'll say it is faceless. But in terms of an perverse order, when an order is perverse, which perverse means no officer in the right senses would make such an order. So High Court actually intervenes in factual matters when they say the order is perverse. But why go up to there? And if they can address it and make the authorities accountable, I think that's when you're converting your words into action, which is required as far as this promise is concerned.
Okay. Ameet, call me cynical. I'm a journalist. I'm trained to be that way. But I do remember that at the time that this intent to, put in place a charter, a statutorily backed charter was announced. If I remember correctly, at the very same time, there was this new tax proposal that sought to amend Section 254 of the Income Tax Act, where it said that whenever a tax demand has been raised, if the taxpayer wants to appeal it at the ITAT level, first, the taxpayer will have to deposit 20% of the amount demanded. Now, I think Mr. Varshney, you, me, and all of us know that the data suggests that the tax department has a very poor success ratio at the ITAT level, at the High Court level, at the Supreme Court level. And this is not when they're only fighting Dr. Lala. This is when they're fighting many other, whether it's Mr. Butani or many other lawyers across the system. They have a very, very poor track record. So here is the government telling you, on the one hand, we want to protect your rights. We want to give you a charter that is statutorily backed. And then on the other hand, they're saying, we know we have a very poor litigation track record. We do raise a ton of cases that we ourselves don't succeed with. Yet, if you want to appeal a demand that we have raised, you as a taxpayer must first pay the 20%. Somehow this doesn't fit in, it doesn't sit together in my head.
So
I agree. It doesn't fit in well, but you must also acknowledge the fact that in the last 2-3 years, the government has consistently raised the threshold limits for the demands for the department to go in appeal. The number of the amount of demand which an order has, against which the department can go in appeal to the tribunal and then to the High Court, etc. Those have been consistently increased, in the recent past. Therefore, this has to be read in conjunction with that. The government has tried to reduce litigation from their side. Okay. Of course, they have also been, saying that a lot of litigation happens from the taxpayer side. So that, leaving aside that controversy as to who is litigating more, the fact is that the departmental side appeals to the tribunal and thereafter to the courts have come down and will come down in the days ahead. So that is one thing. But at the same time, of course, if the real success of the taxpayers charter, and now that it is in the statute itself, as mentioned by Sunil correctly, Section 119A, this whole scenario is very different from the earlier citizens charter, which had no backing. It was just a sort of a piece of paper to be hung in the corridors of Aikar Bhavan, and nobody really followed it truly in its truest sense. But now it would be different. Of course, initially one would have to knock at the doors of the courts in order to get it implemented. But once the message goes down clearly from top to bottom that this is serious business and it has serious consequences if you don't follow it, it will take time, obviously. But I'm optimistic that once the message goes down clearly, it will be followed. And particularly, I'm very hopeful that the 4 things out of the various in the taxpayers charter, one is, which you mentioned, treating taxpayer as honest. Second is providing timely decisions. Third is, which Sunil mentioned, hold its authorities accountable. And lastly, respect the privacy of the taxpayer. For me, forget everything else. Even if they concentrate only on these four things, I think the battle would be more than half won from the taxpayer's perspective.
Okay, y'all are all sounding far more optimistic than I am. Mr. Varshney, can you explain to us what more we are going to get to know about this tax charter, what we right now seem to have as salient points, and how is it really going to change the taxpayer's life? Is there going to be some effective alternate mechanism within the tax department that will address the enforceability of these issues? How is it going to work?
I think all I can say is that intention of the government is basically to provide all these rights to the taxpayers. So time will tell whether we have been successful in ensuring these rights for the taxpayers, but the intention is very clear, and I'm sure that taxpayer would be satisfied with the approach of the income tax department, and surely would feel that the taxpayer charter is working. I mean, at this point of time, I would only say this much, but would like to respond to your query on 20% tax for ITAT cases. In addition to what Ameet Bhai has said, he has already put the right perspective before us. But I would just like to add one more point, that we are asking case, tax demand only in cases which have been confirmed by Commissioner Appeal. And Commissioner Appeal is bound by jurisdictional decision of the High Court and Supreme Court on legal issues. So basically, that means if Commissioner Appeal has confirmed the case, it is not one of those cases where the decision of the High Court or Supreme Court on the same issue is in favor of the taxpayer. That could be the case when assessing officer is passing the order. But even, so therefore we have that condition that, we need to keep that in mind while staying the demand. But when it comes to ITAT, then there won't be any such case. Yes, there are chances that CIT appeal orders may be reversed by ITAT, but probably it is not right to prejudge that. And what department is only asking is that if stay application is to be taken up by the ITAT, then 20% demand must be asked to be paid. And this 20% demand is not extra, because most probably 20% demand must have already been paid by the taxpayer, because if the case was before CIT appeal, then the demand would have been stayed only on payment of 20% of tax. It is not that extra 20% of tax. So in many cases, that 20% of tax may have already been paid by the assessee when his case was pending before Commissioner Appeal.
So I don't intend to, Mr. Varshney, I'm fairly sure I will not win an argument with you on tax, nor do I want to make this about Section 254. But I do want to point out that the economic survey of the year 2017-18 had said that the tax department's success rate at the ITAT level is just 27%. And that goes to show that, often cases go to the ITAT, which the tax department loses. And therefore, if that 20% has not already been paid at the CIT appeals level and it has to be paid at the ITAT level, I think experts like Mr. Butani and Ameet have raised the issue of what it means for the ITAT, but it also means what it means for the taxpayer. But this is not about 254. This is about the tax charter and faceless, assessment and appeal. You've said that you will, sort of deal with our questions on the tax charter at a later date. When there is more detail available. So I won't probe you further on that. I'll ask you one last question because we have exceeded time. We have a few questions coming in from the audience. So one last question. I'm sure all of this is in an effort to expand the tax base. The data on that front is not necessarily very, very encouraging. As you know as well, of a population of 130 crores, as the Prime Minister pointed out, only 1.55 crore individuals file tax. We have, in comparison to the 6.5 crore people who are now assessees, again, only 1.5 crore people pay tax. And some data seems to suggest that over the last 15 years or so, while tax filings are up, almost 60%, the taxpayers, that is those filings that are actually accompanied by some tax payment, is up very, very marginally compared to the number of filings that have increased. Can you talk us through what you have diagnosed as the reasons for why the expansion of this tax base has not taken place in the way it should have, given that it was one of the targets of DeMon, given that it was, one of the things that this administration has worked on very hard?
Yeah, so that I will say is a nudge theory that this administration is now working on. So we know there are books also on nudge theory and everything. So what was happening before, we were collecting information even before, but normally because somehow the time lag has been built in our work so much that because of a time limitation of 6 years given in the Income Tax Act, that most of the time we used to take action at the fag end of the time limitation period. That means the taxpayer used to get a notice from us about something which he has done 6-7 years back. So that was something, was becoming problematic because taxpayer may not have kept the documents for at that point of time. Suppose he invested in shares, he invested in mutual fund, he bought something, or he invested into some house, gave a loan to somebody, whatever information, spent so much on credit card. 6 years or 7 years back information, he may be, very difficult to find and satisfy the income tax department. So that was, I think, was a major hurdle in expanding our tax base. Information that we have right from the beginning. So from this year, what we have started is that we have already starting nudging the taxpayer for just 1 year back information. Something, the return he might have filed, but we have the revised time for that return extended. So idea is that before that time for revised return is, as long as the time for revised return is pending, if we nudge him that we have this information that you have done this, so that nudge is enough for him to either file his return or revise his return and pay taxes, because then he is willing to pay taxes, because he knows that this transaction I did not take into account while filing my return of income. So that is the substantial change that has been brought about this year, which is
Mr.
going to have an impact.
My apologies, sir, for interrupting you, but can you in tax terms define a nudge?
Tax term, I don't know.
What is a nudge, sir? How do you nudge him? Do you send him a notice? Do you send him a dear taxpayer letter? Yes, exactly. What is a nudge? Is it a gentle nudge? It is a hard nudge?
Very gentle nudge. That if you see, you are fortunate you have not received that gentle nudge because you are filing your return of income properly. But otherwise, it's a very gentle letter with a very soft letter to the taxpayer, giving him full respect and just letting him know that this is the information which is in our possession. And if he wants to pay tax, if he feels he has not paid taxes on that information, then he may pay tax it now, file his return or revise his return. It's a very gentle nudge, very soft kind of letter on his email address as well as on his mobile.
Mr. Varshney, I believe there is in the making a slightly harder nudge with regards to the data that you might have from independent sources on high value transactions that you are going to use then to tell the taxpayer that, we're watching what you're spending your money on and we're wondering where it's coming from because you haven't offered this to tax. I'm putting in sort of jocular terms what has become a little bit of an area of concern right now.
So this is the first stage is verification. So that our verification unit, which is there in Faceless, would also be doing this work. That is soft nudge. We are just letting you know that this is the information. And even then, if that taxpayer does not, revise his return or does not explain, it might happen that he may explain that I have already filed my return and that is the proper return. That's okay. Verification unit checks that and it is fine. But if verification unit says that no, this transaction is still not explained, then probably that case can be taken up for scrutiny. So that's a next step. So these are step-wise process which are going to be undertaken. But the idea is, first we are going to facilitate the taxpayer to file his return of income properly, and that is going to help us to expand tax base.
Okay, one quick last question, sir, to you. And that is, the perception is that the burden of tax payment in this country falls on very few, right? As the Prime Minister and you would have pointed out as well. And that there is really nothing being done from a tax policy point of view to be able to expand that net of taxpayers and to distribute that burden better. And so all this effort of high value transactions or soft nudges or hard nudges, they all keep going back to the same taxpayer who's already paying tax. So quick question, and a simple question at that, saying what can be done to widen the number of people in the net as opposed to keep, if I can use the word, extracting more tax from those who are already in the net?
See, it's not that this verification that we have started is only going to those who are filing return of income or paying taxes. The information that we have is also for the people who are not in the tax net. So to that extent, we are reaching out to those people who are not in the tax net, telling them that this is the information in your possession. And then when they decide to file the return, the pre-filing process, we have also started facilitating them to file the return with pre-filled information. So it is not that this verification and nudge that I spoke about is only going to the people who have already filed the return of income. It may go to them also, but a large number of the nudges will also go to the people who have never filed the return of income. So we do anticipate that there is going to be good response to the system, and more people would come into the tax net. And then, as I said earlier, that once we are trying to achieve efficiency in the assessment with less number of officers, we are going to have resources where we can strengthen our investigation wing also, because ultimately the large number of tax evaders, we have that investigation process to catch large tax evaders. So that also need to be strengthened because everything has to go hand in hand. Investigation process, faceless scrutiny process, taxpayer service process. So all the areas need to be covered to expand the tax base.
Okay, so quick, do you have any data on the number of non-tax filers that you might have sent these soft/hard nudges to?
No, I don't have that data right now. System people do it. So they are the people who are,
fair enough.
They are having all that information, and they are the people who send these nudges.
Okay, I'm going to give each of our other panelists 30 seconds to wrap up. I think we've discussed faceless, we've discussed the charter to the extent that we can in the given time. And I have just one question to put to all of you, that the best of intentions often in our country when it comes to policy making are done away with or are reduced to nothing by either bureaucracy or, in this case, as we've already discussed, tax targets. So how hopeful are you, Mr. Butani, that some of these processes might actually get implemented in the way they ought to be, seamlessly, and be as helpful to the taxpayer as the department and the Prime Minister are making them out to be right now?
Menaka, I think you answered that question by saying that it's not just the intention. I think it's execution which is key. Some unsolicited advice I can give: make the taxpayer charter as big, if not less than, the income tax code, because we are a rule-driven country. We ought to lay it down in a far more detailed manner. That is the only way things will work in our country. Number two, at a broader level, make the officers accountable, and make the officers accountable in the same manner. Sunil gave an example. Why do the courts have to reprimand the officers? The departmental officers should reprimand. I have a slightly different view than my friend Sunil on who should man the grievance redressal cell. The grievance redressal cell should not be manned by an IRS officer, no matter how senior he is. So far as he is in the department, there is an inherent conflict that arises. Get one of the former chairmen of the CBDT, get someone from the law ministry, so that the conflict situation is addressed. At last point, I'm confident this will work. It has to be monitored very well, and it has to be, vigorously implemented. Lay down the charter in as detailed manner as it is possible, making not just taxpayers accountable for it, but even tax officials accountable for it. So if anybody goes to the court has to just read the charter. Have you seen what you have written down? You have not implemented. So that the taxpayers don't have to go to the court. And the charter document itself becomes a Bible or Gita for us.
Okay, a tax Gita, Dr. Lala, I know we never did get into the mechanics of faceless appeals. I'm sure that is the stuff worth conversation for another hour, because that in itself sounds very daunting. But can you wrap up for us what you think in 30 seconds could be the potential outcomes based on some of the details that we've discussed right now?
So to be honest, I'm pretty optimistic.
Okay.
And my optimism is not just based on what they have said. It is based on what I have seen in the courts. So for example, when we go to the court and I ask my opponent, are you going ahead with the matter? And he actually tells me, no, we have got orders from higher ups that we should not take unnecessary adjournment. It's so nice to hear something like that. I had never heard this before. Two, when just last year the government has raised the litigation limits. So if you want for the department, so if the stakes in the Supreme Court is less than 2 crores, then they would have to withdraw the appeal. If it's 1 crore or less than that in the High Court, then they withdraw the appeal. And we've seen several of appeals getting withdrawn, including the tribunal where the limit is 50 lakhs. So if really one judges, one judges by the past deeds and one sees the current intent, the two are in consonance with each other. That 20% we can discuss later on in terms of the state because of lack of time. But going by the past deeds, I'm optimistic about the current intent. And even if we achieve 70% of what they intend to do, I think it'll be a huge victory.
Okay, Ameet, last word to you before I take a few quick audience questions, time willing or time permitting.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll, as far as the questions are concerned, you don't worry. I have also gone through the questions. I have assured the participants on the chat itself that many of the questions are, some doubts, some issues, some suggestions. We will compile them and I will pass them on to Mr. Varshney. And I'm sure that he will deal with them appropriately when they are finalizing the various nitty-gritties of the faceless assessment and appeal scheme. So that is one. One thing that I would strongly urge the government to keep in mind is that, all these faceless schemes, the electronic filing, electronic assessment, electronic payment, everything is fine, fantastic. We are, jumping ahead of several other countries in this context. But let us not forget that the focus should be Income Tax Act and not data. Data is only a tool for administering the Income Tax Act. Unfortunately, what is happening is that the focus of the department, the focus of the taxpayer, and the focus of the tax professionals has gone to data instead of to the Income Tax Act. In the past, in the offices of chartered accountants, discussions used to happen about capital gains, business profits, appeals, assessments, case laws, etc. Today, what are we discussing? Java, DSC, OTP, FVU, and mismatch, and site down, etc., etc. So I think while administering, while creating new rules, new regulations, and new ways of administering the Income Tax Act, please do not forget that ultimately it is about Income Tax Act, and it is not merely about the data, because the more you focus on the data, the more restrictive it becomes on the taxpayer in terms of responding to the various requirements of the law. For example, on the tax audit report, the way it is, the format is very clear. I have a right as a tax auditor to give my views on certain matters. I have a right to rely upon certain case laws, on certain judicial precedents, and talk about them in my report. Today, the utility of the government forces me to just keep quiet about all those things. How can that be possible? That is unfair. And therefore, I would strongly urge the government that please focus on the way the data is being administered at your end. Please focus on the way you expect the taxpayer to provide the data. Allow more freedom, allow more relaxation and flexibility in terms of reporting, so that what is our inherent right in terms of reporting to the income tax department, whether it is in the ITR form or in any of the reports, tax audit reports or transfer pricing report, etc. Whatever is our inherent right, that cannot be curtailed by the utility. If that is given to the tax auditor, to the taxpayer, then I think the whole concept of electronic administration of the Income Tax Act will become more fair and more acceptable to the various stakeholders. That's it.
All right, Ameet, thanks very much. I know we're not going to take too many audience questions, but a couple are recurring, so I thought I'd bunch them and put them to Mr. Varshney together. And so we'll just spend another 3-4 minutes on this conversation and not much more, because I know everybody's time is coming to an end. But Mr. Varshney, I think there are 2 or 3 questions. One is, what is the rationale for excluding international tax and central charge cases outside of this faceless scheme? I'm sure you can explain to people about the complexity of all of this and therefore why you've chosen to exclude them. But the second question I thought was interesting, that not many officers are trained on things like transfer pricing or international tax. And so in faceless, when it is random allocation, how will you ensure that the same degree of expertise is brought to bear to these cases? So there are 3-4 questions with regards to this one concern, if you can address that.
Second question answers the first question. So the first question was why international taxation and central cases have been left out. And the second question was that how do you expect a faceless team who do not have a special expertise on international taxation and transfer pricing to handle these cases? So that is
journalists also have a sense of humor.
So that exactly is the reason, because they are complex cases which require a lot of explanations to be done, a lot of interaction with the taxpayer. So at this stage, it is thought advisable to leave them out. And a lot of other, incidental questions are also coming on that, was that transfer pricing. So transfer pricing, if it is done on domestic cases, that domestic cases would be under faceless. And that faceless team technical unit would refer it to the transfer pricing officer, and transfer pricing officer will do the audit and send it back to the faceless team. So far as transfer pricing audit is concerned, that will be done according to the current process. But that assessment of that domestic entity would be done by the faceless team. So that is, that is the process which is thought about. So that, that would answer your question. Unless you have some other question.
No, I think that's broadly, it's how will you ensure, the allocation of cases under the faceless scheme will over a period of time, algorithms, etc., sort of depute cases to areas of expertise? How will this, or has that already been worked out?
So area of expertise would be developed through technical team. So therefore technical team, verification team and review team also have a very important role to play. So technical team would, prepare advice on a technical matter. Now, if there is a particular legal issue, so the explanation which the technical team has built up on that legal issue, considering all angle, would be a very good piece of document to help officers of various faceless team. That way you will develop an expertise on each issues. There would be, documents available to guide officers. So I think technical unit has a very important role to play to bring proficiency and bringing uniformity across cases. Right now, what is happening is, because assessing officers are not in touch with each other, different views are taken on different issues. And even if same view is taken, the reasoning in the assessment order may not be uniform, which could help department, which could help our department representative to argue the case in the tribunal or in the high court. So that is very important. Once a proper document is prepared on a particular legal issue, which is going to help department win the case, that document will be there to help all officers who are dealing with that kind of a case. So that is something which is very important. And that is why I say that ultimately the officers with knowledge, with proficiency would take everybody along. And because that knowledge will spread across all officers, so proficiency in the department would increase. The efficiency in the department would increase. So that is a very important process, and a lot of success will depend on how these units ultimately perform. From the taxpayer side, also, I think now is a time. We know there are different type of tax consultant. They are professional tax consultant, and they are quote unquote efficient tax consultant. So probably time is for the professional tax consultant to be counted more than the efficient tax consultant. I think
Mr. Varshney, we're at zero right now in this process, right? I mean, this is the month you will launch both faceless assessments and faceless appeals. How long do you think it will take, genuinely speaking, realistically speaking, for us to hit 100, which is for us to be able to achieve all these efficiencies that you're so beautifully and utopianly describing to us of, cohesive expertise areas and standardization and all of that? Will it be a year? Will it be 2? Or should we prepare for 5?
First of all, I will not accept that we are at zero. That is one thing.
No, zero as in what I mean is we're zero as in day zero of the schemes.
Day zero of the scheme. Okay,
yeah,
fine.
that's what I
Right,
mean.
Yeah. So, okay, I will give you one analogy and we will end up with there. That analogy may not exactly fit in with this case, but probably good to end this conversation. I had worked 5 years in Papua New Guinea. I mean, all these my co-panelists know I keep on bringing Papua New Guinea always, because I have had wonderful experience working there. So my daughter was very small at that point of time. I think she might be 6 or 7 years old at that time, and we were at the swimming pool and I was inside the pool. She was outside the pool and I was saying, Tanu, come, jump, come, jump. And one Australian lady was actually capturing us and she was not jumping into the water. 20 minutes virtually I pleaded with her. Then I took her and threw in the water. 3 years after that, she was national champion in swimming in her age group. Now, at that point of time, if you were to ask how much time it will take for your daughter to go from 0 to 100, I would not have answered you. I would not given you any answer to you. I think let's try to understand that.
All right, Mr. Varshney, I hope the tax department has the same talent, hard work, and proficiency as your daughter does. Congratulations to her. Thank you very much for joining us and for all your patient answers. To all the 3 panelists, Dr. Lala, Mr. Butani, and Ameet, thanks very much. I hope, Ameet, we've been able to cover many of the issues that you set out in your first examination paper. That we can't get into every single detail in a conversation of this nature, but I do think that we've been able to provide some food for thought for the community.
Thank you, Menaka. I think the lesson that I've learned is that the exam paper was okay. The final exam paper was also okay. The problem was in the duration of the period of the exam. We would have probably had a half-day panel discussion and yet not been able to complete our discussions. But I must thank all of you for having had a very, very enriching discussion today. And I definitely look forward to Menaka having you once again in the very near future, because the way you conduct these panel discussions is a class apart. So thank you so much, Menaka. And I request Vishesh to propose a formal vote of thanks. And I can only just mention to all the people who have watched this panel discussion live, both on Zoom as well as on YouTube, that all your questions have been noted down by us. And while some of them may have already been dealt with during the course of this discussion, we will still compile a whole list and burden Mr. Varshney with the same again, because we have faith that he will read them and he will deal with them appropriately. Over to you, Vishesh.
Thank you, Ameet Bhai. Prime Minister Modi ji, while addressing the nation on 13th of August, remarked that the economic reforms which are being introduced by his government are mainly to achieve threefold objectives. Firstly, banking the unbanked. Secondly, funding the unfunded. And thirdly, securing the unsecured. Probably he may have missed out mentioning one thing, or probably he wanted us to read between his lines, is taxing the untaxed. Perhaps this could be seen from the host of measures which are being taken to track down the non-filers by probably sending the soft for the hard nudges. With this, friends, we would all agree that we had a very insightful panel discussion on the theme transparent taxation and honoring the honest. The stalwarts have given their thoughts and views on the various government initiatives taken, probably the challenges which even the tax department or the taxpayer would face in implementing these initiatives. I'm not sure whether the faceless assessments or the appeals would be seamless or painless, but this webinar was certainly seamless and painless, all thanks to the moderator, Mrs. Menaka Doshi. With this, on behalf of the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society, I would like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to each one of you for sharing your valuable insights and giving your valuable time to the society. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.